In a previous video, we spent some time talking about the basics of object-oriented programming in PHP. In that example, we went through and we put together a box class from which we're now able to create box objects. Our box class is set up so that every box that's created from it will have a width and a height, and we made both the width and height private, so we could say that our objects are encapsulated. Essentially, nobody but the box itself is able to change its width and its height. To facilitate that, what we then did was we added in a couple of set and a couple of get methods. These methods are all public, so they can be accessed by any code anywhere. They can be called on a box and passed values to become the width or the height. Those two functions, set width and set height, then have the ability to be able to put those values into the private width and height variables. We have our get height and get width functions as well, which sort of do the opposite. Since the width and height are private inside the box objects, we can't access them directly, but these two functions are public. So we can call these two functions. They can return the width and height to any code that happens to call those functions. Then, just as the cherry on the top of the cake, we put in two extra functions, showBox and draw. The showBox function simply is sort of a printout of the box itself, where it shows us what the box's width and height is by returning a string that includes those two numbers. The draw function, then, is a little bit fancier in that it returns a representation of our box drawn as a div tag or a set of div tags, so that we can then, with a little bit of CSS, actually make our boxes appear as boxes. In the code that actually implements this class, what we're actually doing is we are instantiating two different boxes called B1 and B2, both of which are new boxes. We call set width and set height for both of them, so that they both end up being given a width and a height. We're able, through our accessor method, getWidth here, we're able to get the actual value of the width for box B1, and then we're able to call the showBox and the draw functions, methods I should probably say, for both of our two boxes so that we can see the output from them. If I look at that in the browser, this is what we actually end up seeing. Everything is basically just like it should be. We have at this point essentially a fairly well-working class, nothing much to it. Probably the hardest thing about it is trying to imagine why we would ever want to create so many boxes. I did in this video want to go on and build some more onto this example to use it as a platform where we can talk about a few other nice little tricks in the object-oriented space that PHP gives us. What I mostly want to talk about in this video is a handful of special functions that PHP makes available to us when we're doing object-oriented programming. These functions are special for a number of different reasons. One of the reasons is that they are never called directly. So unlike our set width, set height, showBox, and draw methods that we're calling directly, we tell PHP exactly when to access them by calling them by name. With this new set of functions that I want to tell you about this time, we won't ever actually call them by their names. Instead, PHP defines what their names should be. They all have special predefined names, and PHP will execute these methods for us automatically in certain situations, when certain situations arise. So that's certainly one of the things that makes these functions special. Another one of the things that makes these functions special is that they all exist in our objects even if we don't ask for them. So our box class as it is right now, even though I have not specified any of these special functions, they technically are all actually already a part of my object. For the most part, they're blank and they don't actually do anything. But when I go in and actually put in these functions, I'm not really adding them for a first time. What I'm doing is I'm replacing what is generally a blank or a less capable version that PHP has built into my objects for me automatically. The first of these functions that I might want to tell you about is one that can actually help make it a little bit easier for us to be able to create new objects. The way my box class is set up right now is I create a new box, and when I initially instantiate that new box actually begins its life completely blank. It has no width, it has no height. That's why I then had to come down and do these 4 lines. It's part of the reason that I needed the set width and the set height methods, was so that I could then initialize my box or supply my box with actual width and height values so that we would have something to be able to see and work with. Wouldn't it be a lot more convenient if when we created a new box, during the creation process, during this instantiation, if at that point we had the ability to go ahead and specify some initial values? What I'm talking about is, wouldn't it be nice where instead of saying set 200 for the width of B1 there and 200 for the height of B1 there, wouldn't it be nice if I could just put all of that right there in the instantiation? Something along these lines. Well, that is possible. The way we can do this is by tapping into one of the special functions PHP makes available to us. This special function's name is underscore underscore construct. Like all of these special functions that we're going to talk about, the construct function here begins with a double underscore. It's just sort of a little built-in reminder that this is a special function that we will not call directly. Instead, the way this function will actually work is that whenever we actually instantiate a new object, whenever we say, for example, new box, the box part here is referring to the name of the class, the box class, but we call it as if it's a function. The reason they have us call it as if it's a function is because what will happen there behind the scenes is that PHP will take that request to create a new box, will create the actual box in memory, but will then execute the construct function, the underscore underscore construct function. As I mentioned before, if we don't define this function, PHP automatically puts one into the object. The default construct function is simply blank. Best I can tell, it doesn't do anything at all. But what we can do with the construct function is we can set it up like any other function. I should be saying method here technically. But we can set it up like we would any other method where it can be passed arguments. So I could, for example, say that this function is going to be passed value for W, which I'll say is a width, and it could be passed a value for h, which I could say is a height. We could then take those two values and we could actually use them inside the object. Again, kind of like with our setWidth and our setHeight functions, because the constructor here is public, we will be able to use values, pass values into an object, and then use them in the object on its private data members, like width and height. So here I could say, for this object's width, assign the value of W, and for this object's height, assign the value of H, so that any values for width and height that get passed to the constructor will become the width and height for that new box. That will allow an instantiation line, like what I have right here, to work. Well, what if here with box B2, I want to still do it the old-fashioned way, just calling the setWidth and setHeight functions? Well, the constructor is a regular function just like any other, which means we can provide default arguments. So if I wanted to, I could say, if the width and height aren't provided, then just give them a default value of 10. So in that case, when I create box B1, I give it specific width and height values, so those should become the widths and heights for box B1. Box B2, where I don't supply specific width and height values to the constructor, it will start off with the default values of 10 for the width and height, but those values of 10 will then be replaced here and here. So with those few changes made to my class, if I take a look at it in the browser, we should see no changes whatsoever. Everything still looks exactly the same way it did before. The only difference is the way that box 1 is getting its width and height is through a construct function instead of through the setWidth and setHeight functions. Now, when we put our constructor in this way, if you think about it, we have opened ourselves up to a little bit of potential problem. In a previous video, when we were talking about encapsulation and protecting the values of widths and heights, we made width and height private so they couldn't be accessed by anybody but the class itself. We then went through some trouble to put in these setWidth and setHeight functions that would then double check to make sure any incoming width or height values were valid before they would be used inside the object as the value for the width and height. Where we've just caused a bit of problem, though, is with our construct function. Here with our construct function, what I've done is I've allowed the user to now pass in any value for the width or the height, which I then just blindly take and assign. So what would actually be much better here would be in the construct function to either go through the same validation routines that I'm going through in my setWidth and setHeight functions to make sure the incoming values are valid, or to make my life easier, I could just call those functions. I could call setWidth there when I actually take the value from W in the construct function, and I could call setHeight here when I actually take the value of H for the height for my new box. With those two in there, if I take a look again in the browser, everything still is exactly the way it was before, but now there's that extra layer of protection built back in, where if somebody were to try to construct a new box, calling the constructor and passing in invalid values, very wide and not very tall or something like that, because those values are now being passed through my setWidth and setHeight functions, what will happen then is that any incorrect values will end up getting filtered out. So that should give me that layer of protection back again. So the construct function is certainly not anything that you're really ever required to use. It's more a convenience than anything else, as are most of these special functions that we're going to talk about in PHP. But by using that construct function, I do potentially save myself quite a bit of trouble in that I now don't necessarily have to call both set width and set height for every new box that's created. I now, unlike previously, have the ability to create a box that already has a width and height value in just a single line of code, which is a whole lot easier to go. One last thing I might mention about the construct function is one way that it is slightly different than other functions is that it cannot return a value. It's understood that the construct function in PHP always returns the object itself. Whatever object is being constructed, that's the object that actually gets returned. So we cannot put a return statement at the end of our construct function. If we did, whenever we actually called the line to instantiate the new box, it would have to have been that returned value, that explicitly returned value that got returned instead of the object itself, and that just really defeats the entire purpose. So it's always the object itself that is implicitly returned. We just need to make sure we don't put a return statement into our construct functions. The next special function that I want to tell you a little bit about might be easiest to talk about if we actually start off by looking at an unexplored capability that our PHP objects have. Here's what I'm going to do. When I'm actually working with my box objects, for box object B1, I'm going to put in a line where I essentially assign a value to an attribute of the object. So I'm putting the value of red into the background color attribute that's inside of object B1. Well, but wait a minute, is that even possible? Our box objects don't have an attribute called background color. I haven't put in anything called background color. There's no variable that's ready to store background color. We had done something like this previously where we assigned values directly to width and height. We had to take those lines out when we made width and height private because they wouldn't work anymore. But here I am trying to put a line not only into a variable in the object, but a variable that's never been declared in any way, shape, or form. Let's look in the browser. You can see in the browser, nothing happens. No error message, no problems, nothing is going on that indicates that there's any problem with that statement at all. Just how far does this actually go? Well, let me try echoing out that value. If I echo out the background color is, and then I will append in there B1's background color, followed by a break, could that actually work? Will it actually come back with the value of red? If we look in the browser, exactly what it did. The background color is red, it tells me. So not only did PHP allow me to assign a value to a variable in an object that doesn't even exist, but it then actually worked. It had the nerve to work, if you can believe that. It did create a background variable in my object, assign the value of red to it, and I was then able to, on the next line here, come back and access it. It's a little bit odd. I always thought that PHP allows that to happen, but there is an explanation for what's going on there. The explanation has something to do with another one of our special functions. In every object in PHP, there is another special function. This special function's name is __set. So again, like the special construct function, it starts off with __, and again, this is a function that we will never call directly. PHP will call it for us. It will call it automatically in situations where it's appropriate. When will PHP call this function? It will call that function anytime we carry out an action like what I'm doing here on line 36. Anytime I'm assigning or setting a value for an attribute of an object, PHP will automatically handle that by calling the set function. Now, like I had said before, all of these special functions already exist in PHP objects, and the fact that the set function already exists is what explains why this line works. The way the default set function works in a PHP object is that whenever the set function is called, it will automatically create a new variable if one doesn't already exist to hold the value that's being assigned. So whenever I call this B1 background color equals red line, it's the default PHP function that's built in that's actually handling that and causing it to work. Now that I've put in my own set function here, I need one last little thing to finish it off, and that is that the set function is always passed the name of the attribute that we're trying to set, and it's being passed the value that we're trying to set it to. If I put those last two little details in and jump back over to the browser and hit refresh, you can see now it has stopped working. The reason that it has stopped working is that by me putting in my own set function, I've replaced the basic functionality in the function that PHP provides. So PHP's built-in underscore set function, which was making that work before, has now been replaced by my own set function, which does not exhibit that behavior, which has now caused that behavior to go away. What I can do with the set function, though, is that I could potentially use it myself to do whatever it is that I want to do. If I wanted, for example, for the set function to allow me to set the width and height, I could do that. Why in the world would I want it to allow me to set the width and height? Well, what it would essentially do is it would potentially give me an easier way to be able to put width and height values into an object. So for example, here when I set B2's width to 100, instead of doing it that way, if I said into the width of B2, assign the value of 200, that's a little bit shorter, a little bit easier way of being able to do what I was doing here in this line. If there was then a way I could trick this into working with a private width variable and have it actually go through the set width function so that that value is validated, then overall I would say this is a cleaner and easier way to be able to write it. So what I could do is I could use the set function to make this type of assignment possible. Over in my set function, I could do something like say, if the name of the attribute I'm trying to set is width, then I could say, for this object, call the set width function and pass it the value that we're trying to assign. We could do the same thing for the height. I could say, if the name wasn't width, then if the name is height, then for this object, call the set height function and pass it the value that we're trying to assign. So with my set function put in this way, the set function will now only allow, or I should maybe say will only react to a width or a height attribute having a value assigned to it. If a width or a height attribute are assigned to it, then it will then respond by taking the value that we're trying to assign and will pass it to the appropriate set function. So it'll take a width value we're trying to assign and we'll pass it to set width. It'll take a height value we're trying to assign and we'll pass it to set height. By doing that, we should gain the ease of being able to assign values to width and height in this shorter, more concise form, but we'll still retain the benefits of having those values actually be validated before they are put in. So let's give that a try and see if that works. Over in the browser, I hit refresh and everything actually seems to be working just fine the way it is. I think I actually made my B2 box there wider. Yeah, it was 100 before and I just made it 200, but that just shows that it's working. What if instead of making it 200, what if I tried setting it to very wide? If I try that and go back to the browser, what happens is I end up with a much narrower box 1. Oh, I'm sorry, is that box 2? A much narrower box 2. What's going on there with box 2 now is that when I try to set its width to very wide, width is the name of the attribute that's being set, very wide is the value. That then calls the set function, where we have width as the name and very wide as the value. In our if statements, we see that the name is equal to width, so we take the value very wide and we pass it to the set width function. So the set width function down here then checks our value, very wide, sees that it's not numeric. So instead of putting it in for the width, what we instead do is we put in a default width of 50. And in the browser, if we take a look, 50 is now the width of our second box. So that seems to be working exactly the way it should be. So it's a nice little bit of convenience there while we still are able to maintain the protection of our encapsulated objects. Wonderful. The other function that's kind of a pair to go along with this set function is a function called underscore underscore get. If there's a set function that gives us a way to be a little bit more flexible, to kind of tap into the process of putting a value into our objects, it makes sense that there's probably also a special function that lets us tap into the process of getting a value back out of our objects again. So let's take this line here that I have. I'm going to duplicate it and comment out the original. And basically what this get function is going to allow me to do is to go back again to something a little bit more like our original syntax, where we could simply say the width that's a part of object B1. Again, we had to leave that syntax behind previously when we made width private because it wasn't possible for us to access the width directly. That's when we then came back and we put in the getWidth function in its place. Over in our class though, if we now wanted to, we would have the ability to put in another special function, this time called underscore underscore get. Again, another special function. It exists by default, but we can put in our own to define its special behaviors if we want it. The get function is always past the name of the object attribute that we're trying to get. So in our case, in the line I just put in, name would be width. Width is the value we're trying to get. Something like what we did in the set function, I could then put a wee bit of logic in here to control giving back different values. So I could say if the name of the attribute that's been requested is width, then I could return a value. I could return the value by calling this getWidth. And if the name that was requested isn't width, I could check and see if the name is equal to height. And if it is, I could return the value that is itself returned when I call getHeight. So at that point, whenever I try to get something called width or get something called height, the object will automatically call the corresponding getWidth or getHeight functions to return the appropriate value. If I try to get anything else, well, essentially just nothing will happen. At this point, I've kind of restricted set and get so that they only work with my width and height values. That can be beneficial. That will keep things like my background color of red from doing anything unexpected, while it also at the same time has now given me the convenience of these shorter statements, these shorter expressions to access and change the different attributes that are stored inside my objects. Over in the browser, if I hit refresh, you see the first line up there, the width of box 1 is 200. That is accessing that value of 200, the width of box B1, through my new get function. So these set and get functions are pretty fun. They're pretty powerful, pretty amazing. They can add some very interesting flexibility to objects, to classes in PHP that you don't necessarily always see in all languages. Overall, I would have to say object-oriented programming in PHP is a much more interesting thing because of the existence of these two functions. I tend to use them quite a bit. Sometimes maybe not as appropriately as I should. Sometimes it's just because they are interesting and the possibilities that go along with them can sometimes be a little bit fascinating. There is still one last special function that I want to point out to you. And that one last special function is a way for us to actually show a textual representation of an object. Previously, I had set up my showBox function so it would return the width and height of a box as a string so that I could do things like echo out a box, so I could essentially see what a box was made of in a way. That's fine, that works just fine and dandy, but if I were to try doing something like just saying echo box B1 without actually calling the method, if I jump over to the browser and hit refresh, you see that actually causes a fatal error. The error is because I've asked PHP to output a box as if the box was text. I've asked PHP essentially to treat the box as a string, and in this particular case, PHP does not know how to treat the box as a string, which is really exactly what I get here in the error message. Object of class box could not be converted to a string, and it's pointing to the line where I'm trying to echo the box directly. If I wanted to teach PHP how to show a box as a string, I could do that through the use of another special function. This last special function that I want to show you is called underscore toString. It's not passed any arguments, no special information is given to it. Instead, whatever string is returned by this function will be assumed to be the string representation of this object. PHP will call this function automatically anytime it requires a string representation of an object. So for example, if I'm printing or trying to echo out a box, PHP will call this function automatically. Since I already have a function for printing out a string representation of my box down here at the bottom, I called it showBox. I could, if I wanted to, go ahead and just make use of that. What I could do in my toString function is I could just say return the string that we get back when we call showBox for this particular box. So the idea is we try to echo a box. PHP automatically calls the box's toString method. The box's toString method then calls the box's showBox method. The showBox method returns the string representation of the box here. The toString function then returns that string back to whoever called it. So essentially back to the echo here. So with that added in there, if I jump back to the browser and hit refresh, I don't have an error now. Instead, I have the width and height of box B1 there printing out 2 times. The 200 by 200 is shown 2 times. The first of those 2 times is being caused because I'm just echoing box B1. The second is because I'm explicitly calling the showBox function for box B1. So again, a little bit of convenience. I think convenience is really in a lot of ways what these special functions boil down to. None of them are so earth-shaking that we couldn't find some way to get done what we need to get done without them, but they all offer such a tremendous level of convenience that a lot of times I find them very difficult to ignore. The underscore underscore construct function makes it so much easier for us when we're creating new objects so that we can create a fully instantiated initialized object all in a single line of code. That's very nice. The set and the get function, which make it super easy for us to be able to put values into objects and get values back out of objects, even when we're dealing with things like validation functions and private attributes. And now the toString function, which makes it very easy for us to be able to get a string representation of an object. Nothing, like I said, that's terribly earth-shaking, all things that we can do without, but all wonderful in their own way and all functions that I'm sure we'll use quite a few times again in the future.